Good morning. It's Wednesday, May 29th. The war in the Middle East is now 236 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. I hope everyone had a relaxing Memorial Day weekend, but I have to say it was less than relaxing for us here at the FDD Morning Brief. Even though we didn't broadcast on Monday, we were getting dizzy from all those headlines making the news, from the Israeli strike on Hamas that may or may not have caused a fire in Rafah, and yeah, we continue to get multiple conflicting reports on that one, to the Egyptian soldier who fired on Israeli troops. There was a lot happening, and that's on top of the lawfare being waged against Israel and new reports about Iran's steady nuclear escalation. We'll talk about a bunch of this live right here on today's FDD Morning Brief. Our guest today is Carrie Filipetti. Carrie is the executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition, named for the legendary Michigan Senator Arthur Vandenberg. Carrie's organization is dedicated to the bipartisanship and pragmatic foreign policies that made Senator Vandenberg a household name. Carrie and her team work here in Washington to promote those values, and here at FDD, we are proud to work with the Vandenberg Coalition every chance we get. President Biden, this message is for you. We all know you've been through the ringer. You backed Israel in the wake of the 10/7 attacks, and then you started to take some serious heat from within your own party. You kept things under control for a few months, but once we hit political season here, it was too hard to contain. So you changed some of your Israel policies. You began to issue harsh warnings. You threatened to withhold munitions. But I must say, it feels like we're living in the upside down. It was Iran that launched a multi-front war across the Middle East, not Israel. And yet somehow Israel is getting saddled with blame. In the meantime, your administration has done jack all to hold Iran accountable, not even sanctions. You've done little to deter the regime or its proxies from firing thousands of missiles and drones. You've lost control of the Red Sea, a crucial shipping lane. And now you're silent while world courts created to safeguard American interests have been hijacked by corrupt autocrats trying to turn Israel into a pariah for the crime of defending itself. Mr. President, it's time for you to step up. You've got to get this chaos under control, not in 6 months after the elections, now, because this war is only going to get worse if you don't. And P.S., tell your pollsters to get their heads screwed back on. If this keeps up, you're not only going to lose centrist voters who care about international security, you're going to lose the entire Middle East. Now for your headlines. Headline 1. The U.S. pier constructed by the United States for aid delivery to Gaza has broken apart. The pier is now out of service. Aid deliveries by sea have grounded to a halt, and the Pentagon says the pier has to be removed, sent to the Israeli city of Ashdod for repairs, and then re-anchored to the Gaza shore. The repairs are expected to take about a week. The $320 million project has been a disaster from the start. 3 U.S. service members were injured while constructing the pier, one seriously. Hamas fired mortars at the construction site last month, and then once it was finally online, the Pentagon said it was skeptical that any aid delivered through the pier had actually reached Palestinian civilians. The pier was barely operational for 7 days before it broke apart. Headline 2. According to a German newspaper, Hamas was planning to attack a U.S. military base in Germany. Hamas was also scoping out Israel's embassy in Berlin. German authorities thwarted the plots back in December. They arrested an operative who was receiving direction from Hamas officials in Lebanon. He had target locations stored on his phone and, according to prosecutors, was looking for places to stash weapons for Hamas. In other news, Europe is finally starting to come around on this Iran-backed terrorism thing. Multiple European countries, including Germany, want to designate Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as a terrorist organization. The push comes after a German court found the IRGC responsible for an arson attack on a German synagogue 2 years ago. But meanwhile, Germany, along with some other European states, are joining the international chorus of countries that want to punish Israel for defending itself against Iran-backed attacks. Go figure. Headline 3. In other transatlantic news, the Biden administration is urging European countries to go easy on Iran at the upcoming International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors meeting. Britain, France, and Germany want to censure Iran. They note that the regime is violating non-proliferation commitments, and they're not wrong. The Islamic Republic is inching ever closer to getting nukes while refusing to cooperate with the IAEA. Now get this. Washington is not happy. The Biden administration reportedly plans to abstain from a proposed European censure vote for fear of provoking the Iranians. I'm losing my mind here, people. When France is tougher than the United States, we've got serious problems on the world stage. All right. It's time for our discussion with Carrie Filipetti. Carrie previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Cuba and Venezuela. She was also Deputy Special Representative for Venezuela over there at Foggy Bottom. She was also a policy advisor to a certain UN ambassador named Nikki Haley. Maybe you've heard of her. Anyway, today, Carrie leads the Vandenberg Coalition, and we're thrilled she's joining us live today on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome, Carrie Filipetti.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Great to be here.
Great to have you. Okay, I want to draw upon your expertise this morning as it relates to the international system that I would argue is currently unraveling before our very eyes. So let's start with this. Big question. What happened? How did we get here? How did it get so bad, seemingly so quickly?
Well, it's a great question. It's a big question. I would answer it in two ways. I think first, it failed its purposes. And second, it was co-opted by adversaries. And I might say that it failed its purposes because it was co-opted by adversaries. So as a quick reminder, the UN was established in the aftermath of World War II. There were four key reasons for it: international peace and security, the principle of equal rights and self-determination among peoples, international cooperation, and then being a sort of center for harmonizing the actions of nations in attainment of those ends. I don't think I have to explain how we failed on all of those fronts. I mean, international security, the war in Ukraine, sparked by a leading American adversary. We have an emboldened Iran closer than ever to a nuclear weapon at the same time that the UN is lifting sanctions on that nuclear program. Human rights, the same thing. FDD has spoken a lot about the Human Rights Council in the past. It reads more like a list of countries sanctioned for human rights violations than a body meant to defend them. Countries like China, Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, Sudan, DRC have all graced its members list in the last couple of years. So it's failed its purposes, and I think ultimately the UN is grasping at straws to try to prove its relevance. And the easiest, lowest hanging straws are, of course, democracies, because they're focused on being self-condemnatory, because they're transparent. And so that's led them to criticize countries like both the United States and Israel more frequently than countries like China, which has seen no UN resolutions either in the HRC or the UN General Assembly in the last few years. But the reason for that is, I think, because it's been co-opted by adversaries. I mean, we have to remember back in the 1940s, there were 51 founding states of the United Nations. Almost 30 of those were democracies. Now, only 30% of the Human Rights Council members are actually democracies, and we're in the 18th consecutive year of a decline in global democracy. So when you have an open system that becomes unmoored from virtue, in the UN case, we no longer have democracies, you can be well-intentioned but easily co-opted by nefarious elements. And by the way, it's not just happening in the UN. That's happening here in the United States as we're losing any sense of sort of civic or religious rooting. That's what's happening at US universities as well, and causing them to stray towards a more anti-American path.
I think that's a really good summary of what's happening here. Let me ask you this. I mean, when you were with Ambassador Haley, what were some of the things that you saw that gave you a sense of how bad things were evolving? I mean, you saw some stuff up close. So maybe a couple of examples.
Well, I mean, frankly, it's a lot of the same stuff that we're seeing now. It's been going on for decades, and the world is slowly and I think only partially waking up to it. But it's all the stuff that FDD has been leading on for years. So just a few examples. Within the first few months of Ambassador Haley's term, UNESCO declared one of Jerusalem's holiest sites, the Tomb of the Patriarch, as a Palestinian heritage site, right? The Security Council as well, Ambassador Haley was famous for calling it an Israel bashing session. Every month there's a session on the Middle East, and it was only focused on Israel. This was, again, within the context of a Syrian civil war, which at this point has over 600,000 Syrians that have been murdered by the Assad regime. It was also during the same time that Yemen was one of less than a handful of famines around the world. These were things the Security Council did not raise. They were only focused on Israel. UNRWA, of course, was something, Ambassador Haley led the charge to withdraw from UNRWA because she personally investigated the terror tunnels, the egregious anti-Semitism, and so on. And then finally, of course, the Human Rights Council. So every single session featuring a standing agenda item, which no other country is subject to. So frankly, it wasn't surprising to me to see the UNRWA tunnels where hostages were being kept. It wasn't surprising to see the false statistics promoted by UN officials, or for them even to take Israel's warnings to clear areas that were about to be bombed in order to protect civilian life, and calling those a war crime for forced displacement. So really the only thing that was surprising to me about the UN's bias post October 7th is that it was surprising to anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. But what you just described from 5, 6, 7 years ago, I mean, it's the playbook for watching right now. I mean, nothing's changed. So you're right. No one should be surprised. Well, if you're still at the UN, how do you think that you and the ambassador and others would be handling the ICJ and ICC issues? I mean, sanctions, is it defunding these organizations? What are the tools that would be available to those that are actually interested in punishing these kangaroo courts?
Well, all of those agencies that I mentioned, with the exception of the Security Council, so UNESCO, UNRWA, HRC, we withdrew from those. Of course, the Biden administration has put us back into those. And actually in 2022, the US had funded UNRWA 34% of its total budget. So 34%, that means your tax dollars, my tax dollars, were going towards these tunnels and facilities that were transporting terrorists and holding Jewish hostages. So obviously withdrawal from those institutions would, I think, be fully on the table. Now, when it comes to an organization like the ICC, it's not technically a part of the UN system. We're not really a party to the ICC. But in the Trump administration, we did issue sanctions against their prosecutors, senior prosecution officials. We can also use visa restrictions, which we used in the Trump administration for those officials who were targeting Americans unnecessarily. So we can still use those strategies. The other thing to remember is that we do, or at least we should have leverage, right? We're the largest funder of the UN system. We're around a third of the total contributions to the system, total of $18 billion last year. To give you some context, that's more than 185 other member states combined. And, you know, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, our current US representative to the UN, has said we need to pay our bills to have a seat at the table. That's fine, but we shouldn't be paying for China, Cuba, and Iran's seat as well. So we should be using this leverage, but instead we're seeing us being held hostage to our generosity. Because when we pull our funding, everybody says that the whole system is going to collapse. It's the same thing that they said when we left UNRWA, $350 million we left on the table. That was backfilled by the Arab world, because the world will not collapse if the United States isn't funding things contrary to our interests. So Ambassador Haley and President Trump both recognize that the UN really needs leadership, and our funding should be giving us that leverage. So absolutely, we'd be defunding these entities that don't service US interests. And I think we'd be taking a much more proactive approach, both to sanctions as well as visa restrictions.
All right. I mean, let me zoom out even further. What does all of this dysfunction at the UN mean for the United States in an era of great power competition, right? We've got an ascendant China, you've got a defiant Russia, you've got a nuclear Iran, or almost nuclear Iran. What does all of this mean for the US? Do we still have recourse at the UN?
Well, this is the most important question, I think. So the UN and multilateral system, frankly, used to be a key tool that the US would use to promote Western values and what you've heard people call the, liberal rules-based international order, which is a phrase that, as a Republican, I can't really stand, but I get what they're going for. And other nations really accepted that and tried not to get involved much. I think China is a really good example of how that has shifted, and now the UN system is a key tool for our adversaries against that Western system, going back to this idea of them co-opting its institutions from the first question. So China, for example, was originally very skeptical of the UN. I mean, they saw it as part of the US order. They were focused on parochial interests and they didn't want to get involved. But under Xi Jinping, they realized that they can actually take over these institutions and reorient them towards Beijing. So in 2022, Xi actually referred to the UN and the multilateral system as, quote, core to their international campaigns and ambitions. And they've done it in really interesting ways. So number one, personnel. There were less than 800 Chinese nationals working in the UN system in 2019. There was an increase of 85% by 2021. They've gained key control of bodies like the World Health Organization, which obviously had huge implications for all of us because of COVID-19, the International Telecommunications Union, ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, and I think most distressingly, China actually now heads the AI development group at the United Nations. So this is the organization that is intended to develop strategies and draw key inferences from things like demographic data, biological data from nations around the world. So just think of this, the same nation that provided the surveillance technology that enabled Iran to identify, imprison, and in many cases kill women who are freeing themselves from their headscarves. The same nation that uses AI to track its citizens to ensure they maintain loyalty to the CCP is now leading the UN's AI implementation. I mean, in my view, the apocalyptic stories really are kind of writing themselves here. And it's also true with funding. So in 2000, only 1% of the UN regular budget was funded by China. Now China is at 12% of the UN regular budget. And we see it also in how they set language. To use the example of Ukraine, those who hold the pen hold the power. And when the UN talks about Ukraine, it doesn't talk about the unilateral Russian invasion. It talks about food security and how US sanctions are affecting that, right? And so this is how the CCP and other regimes have been able to manipulate and co-opt the UN system. So it is absolutely becoming a tool to advantage them and to disadvantage the West and America.
All right, I'm a little depressed. Let me shift gears for a minute. You've done a lot of work in Latin America. And we're seeing a lot of support right now for a Palestinian state in the Southern Hemisphere. And we see some support for Hamas from within that region too. So with increased animosity toward Israel coming out of that region, what is happening right now? What is driving that in Latin America?
I've never been told that talking about Latin America is going to make us less depressed. So I don't think I'm going to be able to do that for you. But listen, I think there's a couple of different reasons. The first is demographics. So a lot of people don't recognize this, but in many countries in Central America, as well as Chile, for example, there's a huge Palestinian population that's very influential in politics. Actually, Chile has the largest Palestinian population outside the Arab world. About 500,000 Palestinians live there. There's also a huge Lebanese diaspora movement. So in places like Colombia and Brazil, they're very influential in politics and have promoted a particular narrative towards Palestinians. In Venezuela, for example, we see this in Alex Saab, who's one of the financiers of the Maduro regime, who's a Colombian-born to Lebanese immigrants. Same thing, Tariq al-Assami is a former Maduro Minister of Petroleum, among other things, who's also Lebanese in origin. And actually, something that many people don't know is that a huge reason for why Bolsonaro, who is very much inclined towards Israel, was not able to move their embassy to Jerusalem is because of the political influence of halal beef producers in Brazil. They are the largest exporter of halal beef in the world, and there were serious concerns about pressure being put against them if they were to move their embassy. So there's a huge demographic reason for this shift. There's also something that we can relate to here in the US, failure of education. So a lot of these things are coming out of elite universities in South and Central America as well. Same thing that we're seeing at Harvard and Columbia. And then finally, I think partisanship. Over the last couple of years, there's been many discussions about a pink tide, this idea that Latin America is becoming increasingly left-wing. I think it's a little bit overblown, but at the same time, the elections that brought in Petro in Colombia, Lula in Brazil, we're seeing those left-wing populates really turn away from Israel. So Chile, Colombia, Honduras, they've all recalled their ambassadors from Israel. Bolivia has cut off ties altogether. And I think this is because there's this sense of a growing autonomy from the US and anti-Americanism that's influencing this, as well as obviously, the far left influence. To end on a slightly positive note, it's not true across the board. So Bukele of El Salvador and Milei of Argentina have expressed support for Israel. And that's especially interesting in Bukele's case because he actually is Palestinian in origin. He has a Palestinian background.
That is interesting. Well, I fear we continue to lose our own neighborhood here. And that's, I think, something that we'll all need to think about and work on. But we'll leave it here today. Thank you, Carrie Filipetti, for joining us live today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD's Mark Montgomery and Ike Harris join forces for a piece that delves into China's stranglehold on global supply chains, extending well beyond e-commerce. Their piece explores the alarming consequences for U.S. military preparedness and capabilities as Xi Jinping leverages China's industrial dominance for political gain. Bottom line, Washington has to prioritize domestic supply chains to thwart China's manipulation. Failure to do so will have grave consequences for national security. On the latest episode of FDD's Foreign Policy, Cliff May hosted my good friend Zev Orenstein from the archaeological site in Jerusalem known as City of David. The two take a virtual walk through Jerusalem's rich history, including the city's deep significance in the Jewish faith. If you've not yet visited City of David, it is bound to be one of the most important tourist sites in the world, especially for Christians. It's an indisputable historical fact that Jesus of Nazareth walked on that pilgrimage road that they uncovered. And finally, Caleb Weiss and Joe Truzman both have a bunch of new pieces on Al-Qaeda over at FDD's Long War Journal. Caleb picked up on a rudimentary training camp in Burkina Faso established by the Group for Support of Islam and Muslims, which is Al-Qaeda's West Africa branch. Joe Truzman has a write-up on the recent statement by Al-Qaeda's General Command lauding attacks against Jews and commending the anti-Israel protests on American college campuses. Flag that one for anyone says social justice is why they were protesting on campus. That about does it for today, folks. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD and support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another episode hosted by my colleague, Rich Goldberg. He'll be serving up some of his signature spicy takes on the Middle East. For a sneak preview, check out his Twitter feed. Ever since that ICJ ruling, he has been on fire. Thanks for joining, folks. I'll see you Monday. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer signing off for FDD.